Final Fantasy XVI is finally out with us, and with all the excitement that arrives with the release of a brand new mainline game for any fan of the series such as myself, there's also the expectations and funny activity that I love to do, that is look for references to the previous games of the franchise. As you may or may not know, Final Fantasy games are ones that, while being completely different universes, will share a lot of elements that builds the basis of the mechanics used in them. Of course, done in a different way. By that, I mean that the enemies and creatures in the world are going to be recognizable in every game, like chocobos and muggles, or magic spells and abilities, sometimes even focusing on job systems for that. Final Fantasy XVI is the case of a game made with much love to the franchise, and from the get-go we could already see the influence and inspiration in previous games such as the Ivalice games of Final Fantasy XII or Tactics, led by Matsuno Yasumi, in details like Cid's full name being Cidolfus, who controls the element of thunder, in reference to Thunder God Cid from Tactics, or locations in the worlds of Ballistea with similar names like Rosaria sharing its name with one of the big kingdoms of 12. To make a guideline about this compilation, I'll be pointing out references through the game's story that I think are specific to your previous game and not general ones like the ones just mentioned. Although I probably mentioned some things that may be more abstract and could be considered Easter eggs, but it's up to everyone to take it or not. And the other thing is that there are probably more thematic references, such as the use of summons in this world or the influence of the crystals, but all of these I personally covered them in previous videos I did before, so I won't focus too much on them. I won't mind if you want to check those out, and maybe if you throw a small like and subscribe to the channel, that'd be nice too. Anyway, onto the content. The first mission that our protagonist Clive has, while he is still a young soldier in training, is a small expedition to clear the land from the goblins and orcs that have been spotted around our hometown. Goblins being the de facto basic enemy in this game since its very first one. They are like the Goombas of the series. After joining forces with our two friends, Not Biggs and Not Wedge, the boss of this introductory mission is to defeat a Malboro, another well-known classic FF enemy, although not usually related with first missions, and written as Morbol, more similar to the traditional translations of the older games. But these are all very generic stuff. The big first Easter egg is when things get more chaotic in the town, and we have to clean up the mess from the invasion of the Empire, meeting our new boss. The Knight of the Blinding Dawn is a traditional dragoon of the series, one of the most iconic jobs. But not only that, this fabulous introduction to him posing like that is an homage to the logo of Final Fantasy IV, who had Cain Highwind, the dragoon of that game, posing like that. Since his introduction, while not the first one, he has been the poster dragoon for the last 30 years. Along this, there's a small callback to Final Fantasy XIV too. And it's that in both English and Japanese versions at least, the voice of this character is shared with the character Estinien, who, as you may predict, is also one of the main dragoons in that game.
May I have this dance? I lost my family to Nidhogg's flames, and 'twas with fury in my heart that I took up the lance.
And we know that the main dev team is the one in charge or linked to 14, so it makes sense and it's cute. After the first flashback chapter, we come back to present time, where we are part of the group called the Bastards, with the objective of defeating the dominant of Ice, Shiva. Each of us have a code name based on a dragon-like figure, and after discovering that the dominant is our childhood friend Jill, we rebel against our small team and fight the leader, whose name is Tiamat. In the original Final Fantasy, Tiamat is a six-headed dragon and one of the four Fiend of Chaos that represents the element of wind. At this point, I feel like every other compilation I did of references include Tiamat in some way or another, because while it's already a go-to dragon name, there are cases like FF9, which is a love letter to the franchise, and have those four Fiend coming back, so it's present there too. After being rescued by good old Cid, and going to his hideout that will serve us as our base for a long part of the game, we are able to find some peculiar characters, in particular this Bard, which is common in the series, but his name is Spoony Bard, and this, along with his looks, is a reference to Final Fantasy IV, as the first part of the series, Edward Chris von Moa, is called like that in a not friendly manner by Tela, after learning that his daughter Anna escaped with him and was murdered during the invasion of Baron against Damcien. Clearly not the happiest of moments in that game, considering that the song playing is called Sorrow and Loss, but everyone remembers that line with fun memories instead. In our first mission along Cid, we go through some forest and encounter our boss fight of the area. This time a lizard-like spiky beast with the name of Fafnir. Fafnir is a dinosaur-like monster enemy that was introduced in Final Fantasy VI, also known as the enemy that I like to bully a lot when I have to record my character using their Esper attacks and animations. While it also got some callbacks from random enemies in later games, usually with dinosaur or lizard-like features. The next hour of the game follows the conflict that both Clive and Cid have against the dominant of Wind, Benedicta Harman, and her icon, Garuda. Garuda is a peculiar case because while it's one of the main 8 icons or summons in this game, it's also not that common through the series history, at least not in this particular design. While still an amazing choice for the wind element, one choice I think should stay. So I think it's at the very least worth to mention that her and her Harpy's friends, the Chirada and Suparna, are enemies that originated from Final Fantasy XI and XIV mainly, even having their appearance in Final Fantasy XV, but only during a dungeon that works as a collaboration with XIV. But once that conflict is over, we get to see the mysterious hooded man around, and revealing his identity, that is suspiciously close looking to Joshua, Clive's brother, who is referred to by his companion as Margrace. This is the last name of a character in Final Fantasy XII, Alcide Margrace. This character is a member of the family Margrace of Rosaria, one of the biggest empires in Ivalice. If that name sounds familiar, it's because this is one of the many similar names that Final Fantasy XVI has in relation with the Ivalice games, so that's a very cute connection. The next section of the game has Clive teaming up with Jill on the journey, as they have to come to terms with their own past. In the middle of it, there are going to be your expected monsters roaming around in between your destinations, and a group of those are the Crayclaws. While they certainly act as your average normal animal monsters to use as a punching bag, this was also a very specific enemy and boss in Final Fantasy V. You could say that I mention it because 5 is my favorite 2D game, but still, games like Strangers of Paradise use this enemy as their boss fight in the dungeon that represents Final Fantasy V, so it's relevant to me. And hey, in both instances, the fight happened on our way to a location that aesthetically matches the concept of ancient technology going on, both in the Ronka ruins of 5 and here in these mysterious ruins of 16. The conclusion in 16 is different though, because at the end of this mini dungeon, Clive will have his starting point to redemption and acknowledging his past actions, and this will manifest in a boss fight against himself, or his shadow self. While I don't consider this a reference by itself, I do see the potential vibes that this could give of Final Fantasy IV, where the main character Cecil, who's all about redemption, fights in a more unconventional way against himself, so he can become a paladin, instead of the Dark Knight he always was, and start properly his redeeming journey. During this section there's also another big Easter egg happening around, and it's a classic one. Through the fields you can explore, and the small farms that exist, you'll notice a couple of scarecrows, but more importantly, the way they are dressed. This strip is of course the traditional Final Fantasy Black Mage outfit, that started in FF1, but appears every time it can, acting almost like one of the many mascots of the series. After this personal arc, we jump to the next big important story-related segment. Led by Cid, we aim to destroy the first crystal of this world, and establish that these will be our objectives from now on, while the main theme of Final Fantasy plays for some reason. Once we reach the crystal room, where in a more fitting way the prelude plays, we meet a very strange and intimidating entity trying to stop us. Once we are transported to this place where this Neon Genesis Evangelion thing is staying, the boss fight starts and its name is Typhon. Typhon is a known enemy that originated in Final Fantasy VI, although it had special appearances such as a summon in Final Fantasy VII or a Colosseum boss fight along Ultros in 13.2, as that's how his first presentation was. As you can see, it doesn't exactly look the same, although I guess they share the fact that none of them have a traditional lower body. During this fight, one of the attacks that we'll use is called Demon Wall, which yes, are literally walls that are coming at you and have to avoid, which is also a reference to a boss fight that originated in Final Fantasy IV, which yes, it was literally a wall coming at you. Although, back then it was more of a time trial to destroy it before that. This enemy replicated once more in FF7 and 12, with their respective unique changes of course. This is a very important part of the game, as it is the last big event before the second time skip in the story. And while some key events happen, we have the first introduction to what's going to be the main antagonist in the game, and Final Fantasy Tactics fans will be delighted to learn that it's called Ultima. That is why, in the word of Ivalice, Ultima the High Seraph, or Angel of Blood, is the game's final boss, and leader of the Lucavi demons. While at first appearance it's more of an angelic look, and this guy over here doesn't look very angelic, we can come back to this when it's our turn to fight him eventually and see if we can find some design similarities, one that includes less arms and more wings at least. Anyway, 5 years went by. Time flies when you have fun. Of course, the context of the world has changed a little bit, and without too many details, we have a new fancy hideout. This is the point in the game where the notorious Mark hunts are available, and there's one of the first ones that is interesting to us, while we can check the more advanced ones later. The one I'm talking right now is the Dosmer. This is a griffon-looking enemy monster here, and while this archetype of enemies have appeared in many occasions, a creature with the body of a lion and the head and wings of an eagle, the interesting part here is the name itself, as it's the name used in Final Fantasy III for one of the rare encounters of the enemies in the Sunken Cave, and it's an alternative version of, you guessed it, the Griffon. On a story-related focus, we start our journey to destroy the crystals once again, and we start by the Iron Kingdom, the one who imprisoned Jill all those past years, so she can have her closure with it at the same time. On it, Jill confronts the Lunatics and their leader, the High Priest Imrean, when a mysterious hooded man signals the moment, and around the volcano, this enemy called Liquid Flame emerges to fight her and eventually Clive, while Jill, in her Shiva icon form, protects us from the lava itself. Liquid Flame is a boss fight in Final Fantasy V, during our objective to, funny enough, save the Crystal of Fire there. The Queen will be possessed, and we have to fight this entity, which in both games has the gimmick that while being a completely fire being, it's constantly shape-shifting around. Of course, during the FF5 days, these were more limited forms, while in 16 you have them being really entertaining, especially if you're watching a video and not stressing about the fight itself. The next conflict involves the Dhalmekian army and the dominant of Earth, Titan's personal army clashing against us. In one of the most nerve-wracking moments, Jill is captured and intended to be executed until someone saves the day. It's not Clive, but our pet wolf Torgal. I'm sure all of you are familiar with him, but here's his moment to shine, and surprise everyone with his power and flashy looks. After a little bit more of story, it is later explained how Torgal is related to the historical entity from the north, Fenrir. While a wolf named Fenrir is not a surprise in any works that include Norse myth, it has been used in the series before, and while there's a couple of examples, the one I relate to this one is Final Fantasy IX, the Eidolon that you get as soon as Aiko joins the party, whose aesthetics match closer with this bluish aura around, instead of a more generic wolf like FF6. The other reason I included him is because my personal theory before the start of the game was that he was going to have some relation with Fenrir, with so much focus on him and summons in general, so I need to flex the victory for a second, don't mind me. Once things calm down a little bit and our objective shifts to Dhalmekian territory, we have some small new things that are linked to previous games. The first one is that this is the introduction of Mid. I won't dwell too much on it, as she was already mentioned in my video about the roles of Cids in Final Fantasy, but we do get confirmation that she is his daughter, something we could predict or assume as every character named Mid in Final Fantasy games have a fraternal link to the character named Cid. Another thing that could catch your eye is how the item selected to be able to walk around the towns in this territory is fittingly the Desert Rose. This key item is one known for being the item dropped by the Ruby Weapon, one of FF7 superbosses, a kaiju-like enemy that is hidden at the Coral Desert and will jump scare you if you're not paying enough attention. In that game, giving the rose to an old man in Koln will grant you a free golden chocobo that allows you to go everywhere in the map. And of course, it matches the aesthetics as they are both found in the desert area or town. After working things out with Titan's Dominant, once back in the hideout to breathe a little bit, we see our favorite engineer Mid planning to finish building a brand new ship. That's probably expected for a Final Fantasy game, but the detail here is that its name is the Enterprise, relevant to us for being Final Fantasy IV main airship, that we get access to thanks to its owner, good old Cid. I have to mention that Final Fantasy III also has an airship called like that, but if I have to pick one for each, I'd pick the Invincible for 3, and the Enterprise for 4, so it's the winner here. There's also the fact that Myth needs Mithril material to finish it, and that's something we have to find in FF4 too. After being able to do some quests and scouting missions, meeting new places like the waterfall that gave me a lot of flashback to FF12 Ridorana Cataract, or crafting materials for new weapons like Excalibur or Lionhearts, which can be also very known terms in FF history, we infiltrate the Imperial capital, just in time to see some chaos and a Bahamut out of control. On our way to reach the palace, we have a boss fight against the enemy called Necrophobe. This name is the one used for an optional endgame boss fight in Final Fantasy V. More famously known for being the one that gives closure to the arc of the iconic Gilgamesh, at the conclusion of that fight has him surprising the enemy and instead of attacking us, attacking Necrophobe instead, and dealing a final blow that involves sacrificing himself, departing with some last words to us. But don't worry about him. We'll see him again in 70% of the games, like no other character. The fight against Bahamut has a very specific thing that I need to mention. When you think about this iconic dragon, you think also of Megaflare. If you see other iterations of Bahamut like Neo or Zero, you think of Giga or Teraflare. As far as I know, the biggest prefix to denote quantity is Exaflare, and it's quite a big attack as it destroys a celestial body on its way. But here, this is the first Bahamut that actually uses Zetaflare in Final Fantasy, but it's not the first iteration of this attack. If you want to see what's the other instance of it, it is... So now we can officially say that Bahamut has reached the same level of magical power as Dawn Attack. After a fight that involved traveling to space, which is not the first time that had happened in Final Fantasy, and some emotional reunion, the fight shifts towards the nation of the Dominant of Dark, Odin. During some previous scouting, we learned that the organization called the Undying has been helping Joshua and Rosaria from the shadows. While the name itself is something that could have no meaning, I should mention that Final Fantasy XII Final Boss has the same name. But the first big boss fight we have against the army of the King Barnabas is against the High Commander Sleipnir. I am aware that this is less of a reference to Final Fantasy and more to the fact that Sleipnir is Odin's six-legged horse in Norse mythology, but I should mention it, as the only time Sleipnir appeared as an individual entity and not just as Odin's steed was in Final Fantasy III as an enemy, looking as you could expect. The other thing is that during the fight, it uses an attack, the Spear of Gungnir, which while still sounded very attached to the Odin inspiration, this spear attack have been used before in games like Final Fantasy VII or during a cinematic during Final Fantasy IX for example. Barnabas proceeds to show us that we are not prepared to face him properly, and after both a cinematic and a boss fight get in Santetsuken, Clive and Jill end up overnight at the shore, spending some nice healing time. Now, this is not a reference, but they have a nickel for each time a Final Fantasy couple have an existential dialogue and end up naked in the wild, while a wolf-dog companion was at the very least close. I'd have 2 nickels. Which is not a lot, but it's weird that it happens twice, I believe. Healing time seems to be helpful, because at this time in the game we are allowed to chill a little bit and do more side stuff if needed, and approach the rest of the journey through the almost dead continent of Waloed, and clash with Odin himself. On our way to do that, we proceed to yet again enter another of these ancient technology ruins or dungeons, and one of the bosses to fight here is called the Control Node. This is purely my own thought, but when I saw this, I thought about the boss fight of Final Fantasy IV, the CPU of the Giant of Babel, who is not only a big technologic sphere, but also has a couple of nodes, called the Attack and Defense node. After fighting some Iron Giant, which is a classic big boy fight in the series, we finally get our chance to take Barnabas down, and through the course of the fight, there's one small moment I'd like to mention. Once the Icon Odin is prepared to do a final blow, Clive, in his Icon Ifrit form, will overpower Sage and destroy the sword. And he proceeds to use the traditional Santetsuken instead, which to me reminds me of the way Seifer in Final Fantasy VIII is the only character or enemy that instead of getting insta-death from this attack, surprises Odin and kills him instead, which eventually leads to Gilgamesh taking his place. See, he was fine since the last fight. Speaking of Gilgamesh and Final Fantasy V, did I say that the devs really like this game? Because not only they are right to do so, but I feel like I've been mentioning a lot so far. And here's another one. The whole party is united and reach to the last crystal to destroy. while meeting Ultima himself, who's going to take both Clive and Joshua to another dimension. This one is called the Interdimensional Rift, the very same name as Final Fantasy V Final Dungeon, a place representing the space between dimensions and where the void is sealed. Which is very cool because it has the very different landscapes of the game in the same dungeons and you have to go through. The way this rift is open is similar to the way Ultima transports us to this place in 16 too. Before heading to the final dungeon of the game, as Ultima summoned a floating continent and shaped it in the form of a crystal, we are allowed to do the last bits of quests and hunts available, and we can check some of these last ones to see which names are references. The first one I want to start with is the hunt Gizamaluk. While in this game the enemy Mark is a banshee-looking enemy, Gizamaluk is an enemy in Final Fantasy IX. In a location near Burmecia called Gizamaluk's Grotto, we can find this waterfish-like creature apparently mind-controlled, so it turns into a boss fight. So we are able to reach Burmecia from the Black Mage invasion of Kuja and the Queen of Alexandria. The second hunt I want to highlight is the ferocious dragon Sparrog. While of course there is a real-life inspiration in these names, there's already an existing wyvern-like enemy with this same name in the game Final Fantasy XIII and XIII-2, who you can find on the Grand Pools or Brescia Ruins, and it also shares the red color aesthetics. The third marking hunt is the one called Pandemonium. This one is a classic. Many games have used this term before for different reasons. The origin of Pandemonium in the series was the final dungeon of Final Fantasy II, the Castle Pandemonium. And while other games like FF9 also made it a castle, there's also games like FF12 that made them a weird enemy. In this case, this hunt looked like a big fancy orcish creature, which mostly matched the aesthetics of the place he's found in, as he belongs to the continent of Walud, Odin's territory, so there's a lot of that going on. And the last mark I want to mention is a very cute one. It's called Dread Comet. I don't know why. I can think why it would. Oh, that looks dangerous. Well, this very cute red chocobo is infamous for Final Fantasy XIV players, and in both games they do enjoy the raw destructions of summoning meteors, which is pretty cool they do that, as I'm not the one suffering for them. I can only say that my first introduction to red chocobos was a gift about having only one fear. After that, there's only left to go to the final dungeon Origin and fight Ultima and its many final boss versions, as you can imagine. Which is where his creepy standard look changes, and it starts getting more of a normal but angelical look to it, which is what I mentioned about the design of Final Fantasy Tactics Ultima being closer to these versions instead. And honestly, ones I'm more satisfied with. I am a big fan of Final Fantasy final bosses designs, so I need my many limbs and bodies to be fancy and artistic, and less eye bags. And with that I finish my countdown. I'm sure that there's a ton more of stuff around, especially thematically or musical ones, that I haven't been able to experience, and will still pay attention and have a pleasing surprise if that's the case, so feel free to share what you feel is a reference, or at the very least remind you of a previous game. I think the last dungeon Origin, or the whole thing with Ultima, has reminded people about Final Fantasy IX final dungeon Memoria, as this is the place where the crystal that originated everything and anything resides. So there's some conceptual stuff going on, and probably many other instances like that I ignored. Thank you very much for watching, enjoy some Final Fantasy, and I'll see you later. Love you!